Chapter 11 Flight Through the Hills. At first, Taran offered to let Ilonwy ride Malinger, but the girl refused. "I can walk as well as any of you," she cried out so angrily that Taran made no more of it. He had learned to be wary of the girl's sharp tongue. It was agreed that the white mare would carry the weapons taken from Spiral Castle, except the sword Dernwyn, of which Ilonwy had appointed herself guardian. Scratching in the dirt with his dagger point, Fflewddur Fflam showed Taran the path he intended to follow. "The hosts of the Horn King will surely stay in the valley of Yestrad. It's the easiest way for an army on the march. Spiral Castle was here," he added with an angry jab at the mark the spot. "West of the valley Yestrad. Now, the shortest road would be to go straight over these hills." "That is the one we must take," said Taran, trying to make sense of Fflewddur's crisscross lines. "Wouldn't recommend it, my friend. We should be passing a little too near Annyevan. Our strongholds are close to Spiral Castle, and I suggest we steer clear of them. No, I believe what we should do is this. Stay on the high ground on the western bank of the Yestrad. We can go through it quite directly, since we needn't follow the valley itself. That way we can both avoid the Annyevan and the Horn King. The four of us can move faster than a heavily armed warriors. We shall come out well ahead of them, not too far from Caer Dathel. From there we shall make a dash for it, and our task is done," Fflewddur said, straightening up, beaming with satisfaction. "There you have it," he said, wiping the dirt from his dagger. "A brilliant strategy. My own war leader couldn't have arranged it any better." "Yes," said Taran, shaking his head, muddled with the bard's conversation of high ground and western banks. "That seems very sensible." They descended to a broad, sun-swept meadow. The morning had turned bright and warm. Dew still clung to the bending blades of grass. At the head of the travelers strode Fflewddur Fflam, stepping out briskly on his long, spiky, spindly shanks. The harp jogged on his back. His shabby cloak was rolled over his shoulder. Ilonwy, her hair disheveled by the breeze, the great black sword swung behind her, followed next with Gurgi immediately after. So many new leaves and twigs had stuck to Gurgi's hair that he begun to look more like a walking beaver dam. He loped along, swinging his arms, shaking his head from side to side, moaning and muttering. Holding Malinger's bridle, Taran marched last in line. Except for the weapons lashed to the horse's saddle, these travelers might have been on a spring ramble. Ilonwy chatted gaily now, and Fflewddur burst into a snatch of song. Taran alone was uneasy. To him, the bright morning felt deceptively gentle. The golden trees seemed to cover the dark shadows. He shuddered even in the warmth. His heart was troubled, too, as he watched his companions. In Caer Dathel, he had dreamed of being a hero. But dreaming, he had come to learn, was easy. And at Caer Dallben, no lives depended on his judgment. He longed for Gwydion's strength and guidance. His own strength, he feared, was not equal to the task. He turned once for a last look in the direction of Spiral Castle, Gwydion's burial mound. Over the hill crest, stark against the clouds, rose two figures on horseback. Taran shouted and gestured for his companions to take cover in the woods. Malinger galloped forward. In another moment, they were all crouching in a thicket. The horsemen followed along the crest, too far away for Taran to see their faces clearly, but from their rigid postures he could guess the livid features and dull eyes of the Cauldron-born. "How long have they been behind us?" asked Fflewddur. "Have they seen us?" Taran looked cautiously through the screen of leaves. He pointed to the slope. "There is your answer. From the crest, the pale Cauldron warriors had turned their horses toward the meadow and were steadily picking their way up downhill. "Hurry," Taran said. "We must outrun them." The group did not return to the meadow, but struck out across the woods. The appearance of the Cauldron-born now forced them to abandon the path Fluter had chosen, but the bard hoped that they would throw the warriors off track, circle round again to the higher ground. Staying close to one another, they moved at a dog trot, not daring to stop even for water. The forest offered a measure of protection from the sun, but after a time the pace began to tell on them. Only Gurgi did not seem fatigued or uncomfortable. He loped steadily along, and the swarms of midges and stinging insects could not penetrate his matted hair. Eilonwy, who proudly insisted she enjoyed running, clung to Melinger's stirrup. Taran could not be sure how close the warriors were. He knew the Cauldron-born could hardly fail to track them by sound if nothing else, for they no longer attempted to move silently. Speed was their only hope, and long after nightfall they pressed on. It had become a blind race into darkness. Under a moon drowned in heavy clouds, invisible branches grasped at them or slashed their faces. Eilonwy stumbled once, and Taran pulled her to her feet. The girl faltered again. Her head drooped. Taran unstrapped the weapons on Melinger's saddle, shared out a burden with Fluter and Gurgi, and hoisted the protesting Eilonwy to Melinger's back. She slumped forward, her cheek pressed against the horse's golden mane. All night they struggled through the forest, which grew denser and closer as they approached the Valley Ystrad. Beyond the time the first hesitating light of day appeared, even Gurgi had begun to stumble with fatigue and could barely put one hairy foot in front of the other. Eilonwy had fallen into a slumber so deep that Taran feared she was ill. Her hair lay bedraggled and damp on her forehead. Her face was pallid. With the bard's help, Taran lifted her from the saddle and propped her on a mossy bank. When he ventured to unbuckle the cumbersome sword, Eilonwy opened one eye, made an irritated face, and pulled the blade away from him, with more determination than he had expected. "You never understand things the first time," Eilonwy murmured, "but I imagine assistant pigkeepers are all alike. I told you before you were not to have it, and now I'll tell you for a second time. Or is it a third or a fourth? I must have lost count." So saying, she wrapped her arms around the scabbard and dropped back to sleep. "We must rest here," Taran said to the bard, "if only for a little while." "At the moment," groaned Fluter, who had stretched out full length, his toes and nose pointing in the air, "I don't care who catches me. I'd welcome Orin himself and ask whether he had anything for breakfast with him." "The Cauldron-born might have lost track of us during the night," Taran said hopefully, but without great conviction. "I wish I knew how far we've left them behind, if we've left them behind at all." Gurgi brightened a little. "Clever Gurgi will know, with seekings and peekings." In another moment, Gurgi was halfway up a tall pine. He clambered up so easily to the top and perched there like an enormous crow, scanning the land in every direction they had traveled. Taran, meanwhile, opened the saddlebags. So little food remained that it was hardly worth dividing. He and Fluter agreed to give Eilonwy the last of the provisions. Gurgi scented food even at the top of the pine tree, and he came scuttling down, snuffling eagerly at the prospect of his crunchings and munchings. "Stop thinking about eating for a moment," Taran cried. "What did you see?" "Two warriors are far, but Gurgi sees them. Yes, yes, they are riding full of wickedness and fierceness. But there is time for small crunching. Oh, very small for clever, valiant Gurgi." "There are no more crunchings. If the Cauldron-born are still on our heels, you had better worry less about food and more about your own skin." "But Gurgi will find munchings very quickly. Oh, yes, he is so wise to get them, to comfort the bellies of great noble lords. But they will forget poor Gurgi, and will not even give him snips and snaps for his eatings." After a hurried discussion with Fluter, who looked as ravenous as Gurgi, Taran agreed that they might take a little time to search for berries and edible roots. "Quite right," he said. said the bard. "Better to eat what we can now, while the Cauldron-born still give us a chance to do it. I shall help you. I know all about foraging in the woods. Do it constantly." The harp string tensed, and one string showed signs of giving way. "No," he added quickly, "I had better stay with Illinois. Truth is, I can't tell a mushroom from a toadstool. I wish I could. It would make the life of a wandering bard considerably more filling." With cloaks in which to carry back whatever they might find, Taran and Gurgi set off. A small stream halted to fill Gwydion's leather flask. Gurgi, sniffing hungrily, ran ahead and disappeared into a stand of rowans. Near the bank of this stream, Taran discovered mushrooms and gathered them hurriedly. Bent on his own search, he paid little heed to Gurgi, until suddenly he heard anguished yelps from behind a tree. Clutching his precious mushrooms, Taran hastened to see what had happened, and came upon Gurgi lying in the middle of a grove, writhing and whimpering, a honeycomb beside him. At first, Taran thought Gurgi had gotten himself stung by bees. Then he saw the creature was in more serious trouble. While Gurgi had climbed for honey, a dead branch had snapped under his weight. His twisted leg was pinned to the ground with heavy wood on top of it. Taran heaved the branch away. The panting Gurgi shook his head. "Poor Gurgi's leg is broken," he moaned. "There will be no more amblings and ramblings for him now." Taran bent and examined the injury. The leg was not broken, though badly torn and swelling rapidly. "Now Gurgi's head must be chopped off," the creature moaned. "Do it, great lord, do it quickly. Gurgi will squeeze his eyes so as not to see hurtful slashings." Taran looked closely at Gurgi. The creature was in earnest, his eyes pleading with Taran. "Yes, yes. Now before the silent warriors alive, Gurgi is better dead at your sword than in their hands. Gurgi cannot walk. All will be killed with fearful smitings and bitings. It is better." "No," Taran said. "You won't be left in the woods, and you won't have your head chopped off by me or anyone else." For a moment, Taran almost regretted his words. The poor creature was right, he knew. The injury would slow their pace, and Gurgi, like all of them, would be better off dead than in Arn's grasp. Still, Taran could not bring himself to draw his sword. "You and Illinois can ride Malinger," Taran said, lifting Gurgi to his feet and putting one of the creature's hairy arms about his shoulder. "Come on now, one step at a time." Taran was exhausted when they reached Illinois and the bard. The girl had recovered noticeably and was chattering even faster than before. While Gurgi lay silently on the grass, Taran divided the honeycomb. The portions were pitifully small. Fluter called Taran aside. "Your hairy friend is going to make things difficult. If Malinger carries 2 riders, I don't know how much longer she can keep up." "That is true," said Taran, "yet I can see nothing else to do. Would you abandon him? Would you have cut off his head?" "Absolutely," cried the bard. "In a flash, a flam never hesitates. Fortune of war and all that. Oh, drat and blast, there goes another string, and it was a thick one, too." When Taran went to rearrange the weapons they would now be obliged to bear, he was surprised to find a large oak leaf on the ground before his cloak. On the leaf lay Gurgi's tiny portion of the honeycomb. "For great lord," murmured Gurgi. "Gurgi is not hungry for crunchings and munchings today." Taran looked at the eager face of Gurgi. For the first time they smiled at one another. "Your gift is generous," Taran said softly. "But you travel as one of us, and you will need all your strength. Keep your share. It is yours by right, and you have more than earned it." He put a hand gently on Gurgi's shoulder. The wet wolfhound odor did not seem as objectionable as before. Which will bring us to Chapter 12, the wolves.